King David Hotel itself. It was in the wing on the right of the picture that the terrorists placed their explosive. And the result of the crime, the tragic scene, is like a serious incident during the Blitz. The hotel housed the British Army headquarters and the Palestine government offices, and casualties were very heavy. 65 deaths are reported, and there is little or no hope of survival for any of the 58 missing. Nearly 50 others were injured. The Jewish terrorist organization, Irgun Tzvai Leumi, openly admitted responsibility for the bombing. Many arrests have been made. Leaders of the Jewish agency have expressed horror at the dastardly crime perpetrated by a gang of desperados. Mr. Attlee in the House of Commons declared, "The British government will not be diverted by acts of violence in their search for a just and final solution of the Palestine problem." Undoubtedly, the people of Britain anxiously wait for the announcement of a policy which will prevent the loss of any more innocent lives.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of this Ziontology series. Just to recap, in recent episodes I have looked at the Great Arab Revolt against the British and Zionists from 1936 to 9. This ended with the British crushing Palestinian resistance. In the last episode I looked at the Zionist policy of Havlaga, the moral and tactical restraint from engaging in indiscriminate retaliatory violence. I explored how this policy came to a de facto end when the right-wing militia, the Irgun, simply started massacring innocent Palestinians in terrorist attacks. I also looked at the 1939 White Paper, in which, recognising a war was coming, the British placated Arab and wider Muslim feeling by limiting Jewish land purchases in and immigration to Palestine. A total of 75,000 Jewish people would be allowed in over the following 5 years. After that, any further immigration would be determined by the Arab majority. This represented nothing less than the death knell of the Zionist project, with David Ben-Gurion writing, quote, "Satan himself could not have created a more distressing and horrible nightmare." End quote. The Zionist reaction to the paper preceded its publication. In February of 1939, Palestinians enthusiastically demonstrated in the belief that the British were going to grant them their independence. In response, the Irgun launched a coordinated bombing campaign targeting markets in which 38 people were killed. Thomas Suarez, author of State of Terror, How Terrorism Created the Modern Middle East, writes of a shift in tone in the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine. Quote, "When the General Council of Palestinian Jews met the day after that, even those considered moderates spoke in the militant and uncompromising tone previously used only by the followers of Jabotinsky. And this newfound support for the more radical right-wing revisionists was echoed by the Labour daily newspaper, Davar." End quote. When the paper was made public in May, mass riots ensued, with Zionists smashing windows and looting non-Jewish stores. Intervening police officers were stoned. Mirroring the Arab Revolt, vital infrastructure, such as electricity facilities and radio telephone lines, were sabotaged on a massive scale. Irgun violence was continuous, and now targeted the British too. Over the following 3 months, dozens of Palestinians were cold-bloodedly shot or blown up in indiscriminate attacks. Mines were placed in their villages, orchards, and footpaths. The Irgun continued to recruit child soldiers, dressing one schoolgirl up as an Arab and sending her to bomb a marketplace. There were also incidents of direct assassinations of British police officers. In a further moral shift, Jewish people were not exempt, with Jewish police officers being targeted and shot, or civilians killed indiscriminately. Thomas Suarez writes that most victims of Zionist assassinations, as in targeted rather than indiscriminate killing, were in fact Jews. When the Irgun bombed a cinema, killing 13 Arabs, 3 Brits, and a Jewish boy and girl, they justified it as the pair had gone to the cinema to enjoy themselves in the company of Arabs. Mirroring the Nazi-imposed boycott of Jews in Germany, Zionists sabotaged Jewish orange groves where Arabs were employed. In Tel Aviv, shops selling Arab goods were vandalized. This violent reaction to restrictions on Jewish immigration could be said to be justified by the persecution Jews were under in Europe. Desperate times and all that. This wasn't the case, however. In the summer of 1939, a correspondent from the Times newspaper interviewed a member of the Irgun, who said his organisation had abandoned the oppressed Jews as hopeless, and that acquiring Palestine was the objective. On the 1st of September 1939, the Second World War broke out. The Zionist leadership immediately declared its allegiance to Britain, with the Jewish Agency Executive announcing, quote, "At this fateful moment, the Jewish community has a threefold concern: the protection of the Jewish homeland, the welfare of the Jewish people, and the victory of the British Empire. The war which has now been forced upon Great Britain by Nazi Germany is our war, and all the assistance that we shall be able and permitted to give to the British Army and to the British people we shall render wholeheartedly." End quote. Historian Benny Morris comments that, quote, "The Zionists hoped that loyalty and wartime service would be repaid with the abrogation of the White Paper and support for Jewish statehood." End quote. The Irgun ceased its terrorist activities against the British. This didn't please all its members, however, and a year later, in July 1940, a breakaway organisation was formed. Lehi, an acronym for, forgive my pronunciation, Lahami Harut Israel, Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, is best known as the Stern Gang, after its leader, Abraham Stern. Stern was Polish, and undoubtedly had a hard life. As a child, he fled the invading German army during the First World War, ending up as far away as Siberia. He emigrated to Palestine in 1925 at the age of 18. During the Palestinian riots of 1929, Stern served in the Haganah, performing guard duty in Jerusalem. He broke away to become part of the Irgun during the split of the early 30s. While Stern disliked the specific policies of the British, it was their very presence in Palestine he fundamentally objected to. In spite of being a Polish immigrant, whose historical roots to the land went back all of 15 years, Stern seems to have really believed he was engaged in an anti-colonial struggle. During 1940, he sought out an alliance with the Italian fascists. The Jerusalem Agreement proposed that the Italians would help the Zionists oust the British from Palestine. The plan failed due to Stern's intermediary being an agent for the Irgun, who was working with the British. Not to be deterred, Stern then sought an alliance with the Nazis. He believed that with the British out of the way, they could ethnically cleanse Europe of Jews by sending them to Palestine. The proposal was ultimately ignored. In spite of using Zionists to break the international boycott, Hitler ultimately hated them as much as any other Jews. In contrast to Stern, around 25,000 Zionists served in the British Army during the war. At this time, it was entirely likely that the Nazis could have marched through Egypt into Palestine, so this was a defensive action on their part. Zionists also pressed for the creation of a Jewish army, which they could then use to further their own goals after the war. They also believed that if they helped the British, they would win post-war favour with them. Colonial Secretary Lloyd George said, quote, "The conversion of Palestine into a Jewish state as a reward for Jewish military assistance is the objective." End quote. In 1942, Menachem Begin arrived in Palestine. Begin was, again, a Polish Zionist, and due to his political affiliations, he spent a year in a gulag after the Soviet invasion. He had been a disciple of right-wing revisionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky. I say had been, as Jabotinsky died in 1940. Begin had a more militant attitude than Jabotinsky and had clashed with him. As an example, after an assassination carried out by the revisionists in the 1930s, Jabotinsky had inserted a line into the Beitar, that's the youth movement, oath, reading, "I will raise my arm only for defence." In 1938, Begin insisted on adding, "and for the conquest of my homeland." Obviously, the second of these lines directly contradicts the first. Begin joined the Irgun and became its leader in 1944. The terrorist organisation would then resume its activities against the British, determined to drive them out of Palestine. It's worth noting that Begin's father had been murdered by the Nazis 3 years earlier. His mother and brother would also be victims of the Holocaust. Forcing the British out of Palestine was for him the only way to save Europe's Jews, and he was fiercely critical of the softly approach of the Zionist leadership. In the 1950s, Begin wrote a book, The Revolt, describing his actions and outlook. He studied the tactics of the Irish Republican Army, with whom the Irgun were in contact. Incidentally, in spite of their later ideological opposition to Israel, many IRA men would be influenced by Begin's book. Initially, the Irgun only targeted civilian administration to avoid the accusation of hampering Britain's military efforts. They bombed income tax offices and immigration centres, while the Stern Gang assassinated police officers. During this time, the Irgun funded themselves by imposing protection rackets on Jewish businesses. The British did crack down. After the Stern Gang assassinated Lord Moyne, British minister-resident in the Middle East, a total curfew was implemented in Tel Aviv, with suspects being arrested and tortured. Moyne was a personal friend of Winston Churchill, who told the House of Commons, quote, "If our dreams for Zionism are to end in the smoke of assassins' pistols, and our labours for its future to produce only a new set of gangsters, worthy of Nazi Germany, many like myself will have to reconsider the position we have maintained so consistently in the past." End quote. British forces did not, at any stage, engage in the kind of collective punishment that had characterised the response to the Arab Rebellion. There were no large-scale demolitions of houses or massacres of villages. I should note, however, that there were isolated occasions of British violence against civilians. On one occasion, in response to the Irgun murdering 20 British soldiers in a bombing, then abducting and hanging 2 more, and also booby-trapping their bodies, some servicemen went on a rampage in Tel Aviv. 5 Jews were killed when shops were sprayed with gunfire. The British had perceived, incorrectly, that Arabs unilaterally supported the violence their terrorists perpetrated, whereas many Zionists were clearly opposed to the Irgun and Stern Gang. David Ben-Gurion referred to the Stern Gang as Jewish Nazis and compared Menachem Begin to Adolf Hitler. Ben-Gurion did not favour a British departure from Palestine at this stage, fearing the Zionist forces were insufficient to deal with the Arabs. At this time, the Haganah actually allied with the British Army to suppress Irgun and Stern Gang activity, in what is known as the hunting season. The ending of the war saw the Labour Party come to power in Britain. They continued to restrict immigration, intending for the Jewish population to be maintained at 1/3 that of the Arabs. A unified Jewish resistance movement now formed, where the Haganah would join forces with the Irgun and Stern Gang. In response to the blowing up of vital rail infrastructure and the abductions and executions of British soldiers, in June 1946 the British launched Operation Agatha, known as Black Sabbath to the Zionists. Thousands of British soldiers raided Jewish areas and arrested over 2,500 Zionists, including future Israeli Prime Minister Moshe Sharett. The Jewish Agency building was raided and documents confiscated, as the British wanted to demonstrate that the terrorism was now being directed from the top. Hundreds of guns and thousands of explosives were also captured. The Zionist response came just 3 weeks later, when the Irgun and Stern Gang bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Part of the motivation for this was because it was where the documents confiscated by the British had been taken. Members of the Irgun dressed up as Arabs and delivered the bombs in milk drums. 91 people were killed. The British made one final effort to negotiate a solution to the conflict, a conflict they had initiated upon the signing of the Balfour Declaration. The Morrison-Grady Plan was a joint Anglo-American solution. It once again proposed dividing Palestine into Zionist and Palestinian areas, with the British in overall control. Negotiations were boycotted by the Palestinians, who wanted majority rule, the Zionists, who wanted full partition, and ultimately even by President Harry Truman, who wanted the Jewish vote. After that final failure, the British government decided to wash its hands of the whole situation. Palestine was costing a fortune, and British soldiers being deployed there was unpopular with the electorate. The Balfour Declaration had been largely about gaining imagined Jewish support in the First World War. The strategic benefit of a presence in Palestine to defend the Suez Canal had always been questionable. Now, with India leaving the empire, the needle swung firmly against it. Given the situation in Palestine, it provided no stable base for defence anyway, with one British minister pointing out that you cannot have a secure base on top of a wasp's nest. In February 1947, Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin told the House of Commons, quote, "We are unable to accept the scheme put forward by either the Arabs or by the Jews, or to impose ourselves a solution of our own." End quote. And with that, the whole situation was turned over to the newly formed United Nations. That's where I'll pick up next time. To conclude this episode, I just want to examine what was actually achieved by the Stern Gang, Irgun, and on occasion, the Haganah's use of violence against the British. Throughout this series, I've asked the question of whether employing violence, morality aside, has assisted the perpetrators in achieving their goals. I'm not talking about defensive violence here, like shooting someone who is attempting to burn your house down. I'm talking about indiscriminate, retaliatory violence aimed at innocent people. It seems clear that Palestinian use of violence, in the riots of 1920, 21 and 29, and the revolt of 1936-9, achieved absolutely nothing. It only succeeded in weakening their position and unifying all Jews in Palestine behind the Zionist cause. The British and Zionist adoption of terror during the Arab Revolt likewise only drove more Palestinians towards the militants. In this case, however, it could be argued that violence did drive the British out, achieving the perpetrators' goals. Historian Benny Morris writes that, quote, "The judgment of historians familiar with the British state archives is that the Irgun's draconian methods, morally reprehensible as they were decisive in transforming the evacuation option of February 1947 into a determined resolve to give up the burdens of the mandate." End quote. I would make the assertion that it's not really conceivable that the British would have engaged in a permanent occupation of a country where they had absolutely no democratic mandate. They would have eventually departed, terrorism or not. Violence may have hurried their departure, but it is inconceivable that the occupation would have been permanent. In this sense, the IRA may have learned completely the wrong lessons from the Irgun. It is therefore not clear to me that the violence achieved anything at all other than playing up some Polish people's delusions of being Middle Easterners engaged in an anti-colonial struggle. Historian Tom Segev remarks that all the different Zionist factions spent years arguing over who really ejected the British. He writes that they, quote, invested considerable energy in the argument, enlisting historians, educators, journalists, and other shapers of memory and myth. The political stakes were high, the assumption being that whoever had expelled the British had thereby won the moral and national right to lead Israel's government. End quote. I would conjecture, therefore, that it's not unreasonable to say Zionist terrorism can be seen not so much as an effort to expel the British, but as a way for people who were otherwise far from the centre of power to assert themselves as major players. In the 1940s, one British brigadier joked that, quote, "The way Zionists are extolling terrorism, we might one day even see Menachem Begin head the Zionist organisation." End quote. What was a ridiculous joke in the 40s became a reality by the 70s, with mass murderer Begin becoming the 6th Prime Minister of Israel. He was succeeded by another Pole, Yitzhak Yezeninsky, better known as Yitzhak Shamir, another terrorist from the even more extreme Stern Gang. When the ends justify the means become the ends. Thank you for listening. If I was to recommend one book on this particular period, it would be Thomas Suarez's State of Terror: How Terrorism Created the Modern Middle East. In addition to being incredibly detailed, Suarez is also uncompromisingly damning of the Zionist use of violence. Any donations to keep this show going are very much appreciated. The details are in the info box.